Welcome dear friends, welcome to my channel. Please subscribe to my channel for new videos. So let us see the lateral ventricles. In our previous class we have discussed about the ventricles and their location. So today we are going to discuss about the lateral ventricles. So the lateral ventricles, they are roughly C-shaped and they are extending, they are present in the right and left cerebral hemisphere as we have discussed earlier. So coming to the definition of these lateral ventricles. So lateral ventricles are the cavities which are present in the right and left cerebral hemispheres. And it is having three horns and central part. So the anterior horn, which is present in the frontal lobe, here you can see that, and it is having a posterior horn, which is present in the occipital lobe, and it is having an inferior horn, which is present in the temporal lobe, and it is having a central part or body, which is present in the parietal lobe. Then moving to the lateral ventricle superior aspect. So how it is appears when you observe from the superior aspect. So we have separated the lateral ventricles, and we can identify the three horns over here: anterior horn, posterior horn, inferior horn, and the central part or body. And let us discuss about the extension of this anterior horn. So anterior horn, which is extending, it is present in the front lobe. It is extending up to the genu of corpus callosum. And from the genu of corpus callosum, here we can identify the lateral ventricle where it is going to open into the third ventricle. So that is called as through a foramen called as interventricular foramen of Monro. And from that interventricular foramen of Monro, the central part or body which is extending posteriorly. And most posterior we can identify the posterior horn, which is present in the occipital lobe, and the central part which is present in the parietal lobe, and the inferior horn which is extending into the temporal lobe. And in that we can identify the caudate nucleus, as we have discussed in the basal ganglia, caudate nucleus which is extending from anterior to posterior. So the head of the caudate nucleus which is present in the frontal lobe, and it is extending posteriorly, and then again it is extending inferiorly and reaching to the amygdaloid body which is present in the temporal lobe. So here you can see the amygdaloid body which is connected to the tail of the caudate nucleus. So this is another image to show you the all the anterior horns, posterior horn, body of the lateral ventricle, and here you can see the inferior horn of lateral ventricle. So moving to the anterior horn, which is present in the frontal lobe, and it is having a roof, floor, lateral wall, and the medial wall. So roof is formed by the trunk of corpus callosum, and floor is formed by the rostrum of corpus callosum. And anteriorly we can identify the genu of corpus callosum. And medially we can identify the septum pellucidum, this transparent layer which is called as the septum pellucidum. And laterally we can identify the head of the caudate nucleus. Here you can see that this is nothing but the anterior horn of the lateral ventricle. Here you can see the corpus callosum, and here you can see the lateral wall which is formed by the head of the caudate nucleus, and medial wall we can identify the septum pellucidum. Then moving to the body or central part. So the body which is present in the parietal lobe, it is having a roof, it is formed by the trunk of corpus callosum, and floor which is formed by the sloping surface from lateral to medial. We can identify the head of the caudate nucleus or body of the caudate nucleus. Then we can identify the upper surface of the thalamus and the choroid plexus as well. The body of fornix most medially. And coming to the medial wall, which we can identify the septum pellucidum. This is nothing but the septum pellucidum, and this cavity is called as the third ventricle. And lateral wall, which is narrow and where it is going to connect with the roof and floor, they are communicating with each other. Coming to the posterior horn, which is extending into the occipital lobe, it is having a roof, lateral wall on the floor, roof, lateral wall on the floor. So coming to the roof are formed by the tapetum of corpus callosum. And medially we can identify the two elevations. Above elevation is formed by the bulb of posterior horn, and below elevation, which is called as calcareous, it is formed by the calcarine sulcus. Calcarine sulcus you can study in the sulci and gyri of the cerebral hemispheres. And coming to the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle. So the inferior horn of lateral ventricle, which is present extending into the temporal lobe. It is having a roof, which is formed by the tapetum of corpus callosum, and the tail of the caudate nucleus. This is the tail of the caudate nucleus. So the tail which is connected with the amygdaloid body or amygdaloid nucleus, and striatum terminalis. And floor which is formed by the hippocampus. floor is formed by the hippocampus and fimbriae of hippocampus. Fimbriae are nothing but white matter which is covering the hippocampus. And coming to the lateral wall is formed by the tapetum of corpus callosum. So the tapetum of corpus callosum, which is forming the roof and then extending downwards and forming the lateral wall of the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle. So that is about the lateral ventricles and the horns of the lateral ventricles, and as well as the central part of the body of the lateral ventricle. So here you can identify the lateral ventricles which are opening into the third ventricle called through a foramen called as interventricular foramen of Monro. And the third ventricle opens into the fourth ventricle through a duct called as cerebral aqueduct of Sylvius. So this is the end of the lateral ventricles. So in the next class we are going to discuss about the third ventricle, and after that we are going to see the fourth ventricle. Thank you, dear students. See you soon.